Good morning. I am a science fiction author, and I can tell you for sure that the current climate has not made my job any easier. In fact, it makes it a lot harder to try and think of things that are completely out of the realm of possibility. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We heard a lot yesterday about the importance of not just fighting against something, not just denying the correctness or the appropriateness or the way that things are being done, but presenting an alternative that is sustainable, that makes sense, an alternative world that is the world that we want. And we do that for a number of different reasons. We do it for memory and storytelling and persuasion. I know yesterday one of the things that stuck with me was the blockchain baby and the traffic calmer. We do it as a way to create collective ideas that we can all understand together and thereby work for together. So as I was listening yesterday to the idea of designing for trust, it was fascinating, and I agreed with a lot of the principles, but I wasn't really sure exactly what was meant by it until I had some of those examples, like the traffic calmer. And I wasn't really sure, although the blockchain baby idea did stick with me, I wasn't really sure what the purpose of it was until she mentioned the idea that possibly the state of California as an entity might collapse. And then suddenly it made sense. I could imagine the possibility of what it would be like to need to have a baby registered on blockchain rather than with a defunct state of California. So by putting these ideas in the form of a story, of a narrative, by thinking out the world around them, it enables us to work together towards that common goal. Harari, in his book, actually suggests that that might be the origins for consciousness, was this imagining, even just slightly into the future, of what will happen if we do this? What will happen if we do that? What will happen if we plan to trap the woolly mammoth instead of just running at it with spears? So we need narrative for collective action. We need narrative to work together. I also want to suggest that we need to come up with possible speculative futures, even outrageous, completely strange and wonderful and impossible speculative futures, because not only do they give us a sense for that possible world that we can work towards, but they also remind us that the world that we're in now is not inevitable. Knowing that there's a possible different future or a possible different present, and elaborating it in such a way that you can believe in it is one of the ways that we can remember that it is possible to change. And I do want to point out a couple of things about this quote, particularly that we're talking not only about an alternative imagined order, but that we're talking about an existing imagined order. Because our impressions, our knowledge about the world that we live in are also, in many ways, approximate and even fictional. And I point this out for two reasons. One is so that we can feel comfortable with the idea of using fiction to create our stories when we don't have any examples yet of the worlds that we want to create, that we can come up with ideas and work through them. But also, I just want to point out that the order that we are trying to change is also in many ways fictional. We heard yesterday about the ways that the nation state is something that we have invented and that we believe in, just as currency in its current form today is not something that exists separately. It's something that we collectively believe in and therefore make it a fact in our lives. So we can do that with other futures as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book, Infomocracy, and especially how I came up with it. And then I want to talk a little bit about this process of coming up with speculative futures in such a way that they make sense, that they give us a cohesive order that we can think about together and collectively work for, and remind us also that where we are is something that we can change. So my book is called Infomocracy. I came up with the idea. I was working as an international humanitarian aid worker and development worker and traveling a lot and living in a lot of different places. And I started to get really frustrated as I noticed the number of places I lived in that had separatist movements and had often had violent wars over whether people were allowed to leave the constraints of a nation state or not. So I was working in Sri Lanka, I was working in Darfur before South Sudan separated, I was working in Indonesia, where East Timor had recently left, and there were other separatist movements in Aceh and Maluku. And in between these places that, you know, we sort of think of as being maybe unsettled and having these problems, I was also traveling in places like Spain, where people were very upset about Catalonia even back then, and now are even more upset. I was traveling to Scotland, which was thinking about independence and what level of independence would make sense for them. In Italy, in the north of Italy, even in the United States, where there are perennial demands for secession from various different parts of the country, some of which I think would be a great idea. And so I was really frustrated as to why, particularly in places that were democracies, there was such a resistance to people separating off from the country that they would go to war to prevent this. And at the same time, I was following and voting in presidential elections in the United States and looking as over time our data let us get more and more granular about the results. And so we would see, you know, the sort of state coloring goes back a while, but then we got to county level coloring and zip code level coloring so that we would have dots of red and blue scattered all over the map. And particularly when you don't win, this is very frustrating to look and see how many people agree with you completely and would like to be living in a country governed by the policies that you prefer. And, you know, why couldn't we actually just have the people in the blue dots have blue laws and the people in the red dots have red laws and then see which one works out better? Certainly as someone with a political science background, I was really interested in being able to run some of those experiments, but also mainly in living in the kind of country that I preferred. So I came up with an idea for what I call in the book microdemocracy. In the book, the nation state is more or less dead, not really mourned. And instead what we have is a system in which the basic unit of jurisdiction is 100,000 people. Now, you'll note it's a population denomination. It's not by territory. So this could be a couple of city blocks, or it could be hundreds of square miles of rural area. In either case, this unit, which I call a sentinel of 100,000 people, can vote in the election for any government that it wants anywhere in the world. In the book, there are about 2,000 governments existing. Some are very local and really only deal with local interests and only have a couple of sentinels. Some are global and spread all over the world and competing for as many sentinels as they can possibly convince to vote for them. And these governments vary quite a lot. Some of them are based on corporate coalitions, and they design their laws and procedures and cultures to ensure that people continue to both provide them with products through their labor and purchase their products. Some of them are very policy-based, sometimes single issues, sometimes more broadly. Some of them really focus on cultural attributes and hark back to the days of nation states when people believed that they had a kind of homogeneity that was worth preserving in some way. But all of these different governments are trying to reign over territories that are sometimes very scattered. People are trying to choose from a vast number of different possibilities. And so although this is something that's possible with the technology we have now, we know we have states that are non-contiguous. We have Alaska, we have Ceuta, we have Gibraltar. But this is obviously quite a bit more complicated. So I invented also something to deal with my other frustration around elections in the United States, which was the fact that I could no longer have arguments with people I disagreed with, because we no longer had a common basis of fact to argue on. I became very frustrated with the fact that I was talking to people who would watch a completely different source of news than I did, and therefore, when we tried to discuss legitimate ideological differences, we would end up talking about facts that were not actually facts. We would end up crossing purposes because we had different ideas of what was going on in the world. We were talking about different studies and different data. So I wanted a grown-up in the room of information. I created a global bureaucracy that you can consider a cross between the UN and Google. And I called it information because I am a creative writer. And so this is a bureaucracy that is entirely dedicated to information management and is there to make sure that all the information in the world is compiled, collected, and made available to everybody, and sometimes pushed in front of their face by annotating a political speech or a commercial advertisement to make sure that people know what the basis is. for these things. So that's my book. I will tell you now that it is, in fact, a thriller, despite what I've just been talking about. There are chase scenes, there are katanas and flamethrowers and throwing stars, and there's sabotage, there's some sex, there's some stabbing. It is, it's fun. It's not just completely wonky. But I'm not going to talk too much about the part of how to write a thriller right now. That's a different lecture. But I do want to talk a little bit about the world building part and the ideas of coming up with a world that makes sense to people and that they can fit in and feel like it's a possible future. Because that's what we want. We want futures that are possible enough for people to believe that they could create them, and certainly to believe that they're an alternative to what we have now. So another concept that I came up with in the book is narrative disorder. It's something that we all suffer from to varying degrees. We all ingest narratives all the time, not just from books and movies and TV shows, but from feature news stories, which make sure that they have the arc and the redemption, the question at the end, the possible yes or the possible no. We ingest them to such an extent that we can even find narratives in 5-second commercials that come before the video we want to watch on YouTube. All they have to do is show us a couple of cues, and our brains fill in the rest of the story because we're so used to certain types of story shapes, certain arcs, certain tropes, the images and the words that will trigger to tell us what kind of story we're watching. So narrative disorder, which is something we all suffer from, but which in the future that I have invented is a diagnosable medical condition, has two symptoms. One is an addiction to narrative, which I certainly plead guilty to. And I think just judging from the number of movies that are churned out and new TV shows and the books that we can read in the library is a pretty common affliction in our society. And narrative perception, which is, as I said, this ability to see those narratives that we're so used to in even very truncated sections, to build them out of the slightest hints. And this works both for us and against us. Because on the one hand, narrative tropes aren't always true. Narratives look for a kind of satisfaction at the end of them, and we don't always get that in life, right? So sometimes you expect something that's not going to happen, and it leads to misinterpreting the situation that you're in. On the other hand, since all of us are working on the basis of these shared narratives, different across different cultures and times, but most of the people in the same society are dealing with a lot of the same shared narratives, often they end up acting in the ways that you would expect from those narratives. So sometimes this can be a kind of intuition that's very helpful. At least that's how it works out for the spies in my book. But for us, what's also important is that narratives help us to determine the plausibility of a story. This narrative dysfunction helps us to know when something makes sense to us in terms of the way people act. It's kind of another sense that we've developed for thinking about whether stories work or not. I like this quote from Conan Doyle about the impossible and the improbable. And I think it's really useful for us also as activists and as speculative future creators, as well as for detectives, because sometimes we need to determine what is possible as we're looking to move forward, and we need to eliminate totally impossible routes to the futures that we want and work for something that's improbable. But I like even better the response to it from Douglas Adams, another important speculative fiction writer, who says that actually the impossible is just something we don't know about yet, but the improbable, that's contradicting something that we know very well. We actually understand a lot about what's going on. We understand about the way people are likely to act. We understand a lot about the way that a world will fit together and make sense, or the way that it won't. And so sometimes what we need to do is think of a completely impossible future that is plausible in the way people act within it. Sometimes we need to go really wild and radical, but make sure that we build a world that is coherent, that seems like it's a world that deals with this humanity that we have to deal with every day. And it's that very impossibility leading to a plausible future that will help us in our present to figure out ways that we can change in smaller but vital, fundamental ways for a better present. Thank you.
Awesome. So Malka is going to be doing a workshop later today with a really cool squad of artists, science fiction writers, and facilitators. So it's in room W300 right after the lunch. So we're going to go into a bit of a Q&A session. So let's go over into our onstage living room, complete with plants. And I want to pull up a tool. We'll have to take a little moment to test drive it for those who haven't used it before. So yesterday, for those of you who are here, we used a tool called Slido. So you can go to slido.com. It's a web app, so you don't have to download anything. And enter the code hashtag PDF18. And there you can ask some questions for us as we go into it. So why don't we start with the first upvoted question, which everyone, you can also upvote. So if you have a really cool question that you see, upvote it. So could you discuss the different impacts and importance of utopian versus dystopian visions of the future?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question, actually. I mean, I personally, as a reader, I think it's really important to have as many different types of visions of the future as possible. I think you can have a lot of value depending on the person who's reading and how they take in knowledge and how they assimilate ideas of these future worlds. Sometimes a dystopian, a sort of warning, can be more effective than a utopian, something to aim for. However, as a writer, personally, and as an individual reader, in my preferences, I think this is actually something that's important too as we think about world building as an activist tool and as a planner tool. For me, it's important to have something that is neither. Because, first of all, if you are really, truly utopian or dystopian, it's a pretty boring story because it's very hard to have a thriller when everything is either perfect or impossibly bad. So there's that. But also, you know, if we want to create a future that's plausible for us, that we can imagine living in, it needs to be something that's, you know, kind of on the scale of where we are, where we can see that there are bad things, that things don't always work out perfectly, that there are good things. You know, when I wrote my book, I wrote it out of a lot of frustration, but I never imagined that it would end up being a perfect system. I imagined it being a system that would have flaws. And so part of the point of running through these futures is to see where the flaws come out in your ideas.
It's interesting. I know when Mika and I read the book, we were having a debate. Is it dystopian? Is it utopian? And I kept falling on, no, it's totally dystopian. Mika's like, it's a possibility. It's optimistic. And it was a really funny debate we had between us. So it's a good point.
Success.
Yes, success. So far, let's go to the next question up here from Mika, actually. So far, the most impactful science fiction show for giving us positive visions of the future is Star Trek, which I think we were playing this morning, actually, for me. So. But can we get something more than tricorders?
Tricorders.
Yes.
So, you know, I think there's a tendency to think about science fiction as a way to think about cool tech, which it is great for. And, you know, we love the cool tech. I love the cool tech, definitely, and put some in there. But in any of these, you know, tech and society are always inextricably linked. And so anytime that you're developing new tech and new possibilities of doing things, the society is going to change too. And similarly, you know, I was really looking at it more from the societal, the sort of soft science fiction side, but I needed to put tech in there to make sure that it would work out as I wanted it to make this something viable and interesting that we could get our teeth into. So, I mean, if you look at Star Trek, there's a whole lot of things in there about the society of the Federation. And a lot of them are implicit, which I think makes it even more powerful in terms of how we assimilate it as viewers and think, oh, you know, this is a future where humanity gets along. And it's a future where, gosh, they don't seem to worry about much money, do they? No. at all. But I think also, you know, there's also a point in there about the importance of having those stories and those adventures because, you know, it's easy enough to say, imagine going where no person has gone before. And it sounds cool. Okay, but if you play it out through the series and you have time to run episodes iteratively over and over and actually show how this works out, and you get to engage with the problems that causes and the successes and the adventures and the personalities and the love stories and the rivalries and so on, it makes it much more real as something that we could aspire to and as something that would, you know, be in existence. That again, it's not perfect, it's not a fantasy, it's something that could potentially happen that we can work towards.
Well, I hope that we get one of those weapons that disarms all other weapons, metal weapons. That is such a dream.
This was in my book. Again,
yes.
it's a little bit of a narrative kick because guns are very boring narratively. And like hugely misused in Hollywood narratively. And so, part of it was that I thought, well, it would be a lot more fun to write katana battles and flamethrower battles than to write gun fights. So I did that. But of course, a lot of it also had, an aspirational angle to it.
Yeah, that's for sure. I could see that and want that. So I know that you're an organizational sociologist, and one of the questions that we had up here is how organizations in this space and civic tech might think and integrate science fiction into their work, or maybe some of the processes that you used as an author to think through the writing process and the creative process.
Well, that is what we're going to talk about in the workshop this afternoon. So without doing too many spoilers, I just want to say that I do think that some of these elements of world building can be really useful in terms of, and I was just at a conference last week about ethics and philosophy and technology and engineering, and it was a lot of people who were thinking we need to think about the way our products and our technologies that we develop are going to affect people. And you can do a certain amount of testing, right? You can talk to people, you can do surveys, but really, because we all have this narrative brain, thinking it through and playing it forward in an in-depth way where you really think about not just effects, but second-order effects and third-order effects and what else is happening at the same time. And doing that, often, because it can be difficult if you're an author, you can do it by yourself. But if you're in an organization, what's great is to do it also in a group and work those things out together and play with the ideas. And it's both, kind of a fun team building thing for what that's worth, but, more importantly, it's really thinking about the impacts that your tech will have beyond profit, beyond engendering more tech, really thinking about the way they might change society and the way that changing society might, in feedback, affect your tech. And in terms of activism as well, again, I'm a social scientist. I thought about my science fiction as a very social science fiction and organizational science fiction. Thinking through the kinds of worlds that we want to create and thinking through the effects that we'll have, accepting that they're not all going to be great for everybody, can really help us both make sure that it's a collective vision where we're interacting with other people and not clinging to one single utopia that we are determined we are the genius who thought of, but going back and forth with that, and also, really making it better and letting it evolve as things change very rapidly in our present.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking, this is going back to a bit of an earlier question that we had on dystopias and utopias, but how does the current proliferation of tech dystopias? It sometimes feels that we're living in a tech dystopia and we have to black out all of the cameras on our phones and on our computers. Someone's watching us. It's kind of like Minority Report made real. So how does this current proliferation of tech dystopias, what does it tell us about how we're imagining and we're seeing our world and how we can reimagine it?
Well, I think there's two answers that I have to that. The first one is narrative disorder. There's a strong impulse in the news media to sensationalize tech stories, and you see this particularly around AI. You have constant stories where at least the headline, if not the story, are conflating AI and robots. You have always the image of the female bot for the sex bot stories, and then you have the angry Boston Robotics jumping Terminator bot for the other stories, and very little actual thought about what this means and where the real dangers are. So part of it is has to do with sort of news media playing off of Hollywood, playing off of news media, and going back and forth. And that's something I think we need to challenge wherever possible as people who work in the area know better. But the other thing I think is that when we worry about tech in a tech dystopia, very often, we're missing the point, because tech can be used either way. If we look at, the immediate questions of the internet and democracy, the internet is a massively democratizing technology, as it is a massively anti-democratic technology. We can say the same about television. When television came out, it brought an immediacy of what. We'll stay with politics for the moment. What politicians had to say to the people, people were able to see it without traveling to go to a speech, right? Yeah. And now we see it's also very anti-democratic in other ways. Even books, which we love to think of as, a neutral good because we love books, but also books, we have seen books being used in very elitist ways and very anti-democratic ways. So we need to remember that, the tech functions as it does because we design it and we apply it. And so when I think about tech dystopias, I really think about they're dystopias about human society.
That's real. So speaking of dystopias, now moving in a different direction, how do we get more people to think of the impossible? Maybe think outside of dystopia, put it somewhere else, somewhere we haven't gone before, or is that possible to think of the impossible?
First of all, read more fiction. We have some great examples at the bookseller up there, not just mine, but also some of my colleagues who are going to be with us at the workshop. And yeah, read more fiction, watch more movies that don't tell you the same thing as the previous 6 Marvel movies that you saw. And I think also we need to cultivate a certain amount of optimism, which is really difficult and important partly because of the times we're living in. You know, I think there are super optimistic times when we need to cultivate maybe realism. But right now I think it's really important to cultivate optimism, if nothing else because it's useful to us. It's the way that's more practical is to think optimistically, because if we don't, we have very few options. So cultivate optimism even when it's ridiculous optimism. Think about ridiculous possibilities, because getting in your head to a place where those ridiculous, impossible ideas seem plausible and you can imagine them is part of how you can get to incrementally better ideas. And I don't want you to stop at incremental. I love radical change. But I also think that, you know, part of what is helpful of imagining radical change is to achieve even that little bit of change. And that is how we get farther.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, before we go, we have about 30 seconds, and I think there's one more question I would like to know. Someone asked, what are some examples of the ways science fiction has shaped real life? But can you think of one example that you really like, that where sci-fi has maybe changed the way we're living now?
I think, well, there are so many examples, again, of tech from sci-fi that have worked. But, you know, I mean, look at Utopia.
Yeah.
Utopia was science fiction. And it has changed, not giving us a utopia, which hopefully he didn't expect. I don't know, maybe he did. But it definitely changed the way people thought about governance in their world. You know, there's a famous quote from Ursula Le Guin that says, "It seems impossible now to imagine the end of capitalism, but it seemed impossible once to imagine the end of the feudal system and the rights of kings."
Well, that is some optimism for this morning. So everyone, go buy Malka's books. And also, there's some other folks. I know Deji's books are upstairs as well on the 3rd floor.
Yep.
And right in our coffee break at 10:15, you'll be signing books there, right?
Yes.
I know I need to buy Null States and read it, so I'll be up there too.
Great.
Cool. Thank you so much, Malka.
Thank you.